On the morning of June 30th, 1908, in one of the most remote corners of Siberia, the sky split open. Witnesses 80 kilometers away said they were knocked off their feet. Windows shattered across hundreds of miles. Reindeer herders near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River were thrown from their tents by a wave of heat so intense it felt like the world was on fire. And then, a sound. An explosion so massive it registered on seismographs across Europe. The pressure wave circled the globe, twice. When scientists finally reached the impact site 19 years later, because that's how remote this place was, they found something that made no sense. 2,000 square kilometers of Siberian forest had been flattened. 80 million trees, all toppled outward from a single point. Like a giant had pressed a fist into the earth and exhaled. But there was no crater, no impact site, no meteor fragments embedded in the soil. Whatever had hit the Tunguska region in 1908 had seemingly vanished into thin air. This is the Tunguska event, and it is one of roughly 8 mysteries on this planet that science has studied for decades and still cannot fully definitively explain. Here's what I find fascinating. In an era where we've mapped the ocean floor, sequenced the human genome, and sent telescopes to the edge of the observable universe, we still live on a planet full of things that genuinely baffle us. Not because we lack intelligence, but because the universe and the Earth itself are older, stranger, and more layered than any single discipline can fully capture. So let's go through them one by one. Back to Tunguska for a moment, because the story gets stranger the deeper you go. For most of the 20th century, scientists assumed a meteorite was responsible, but the absence of a crater and the absence of any significant extraterrestrial material in the soil kept complicating that theory. Then came a second hypothesis, a comet made largely of ice and volatile gases, which would have disintegrated and vaporized high in the atmosphere before ever reaching the ground. That would explain the aerial blast. It would explain the radial pattern of fallen trees, and it would explain why there was nothing left to find. The problem is that we've never found convincing evidence of cometary material either. A third hypothesis, still considered fringe but worth mentioning, is that the object entered the atmosphere at a shallow angle and actually skipped back out into space, like a stone skipping across water. This would account for the lack of any crater or residue. The current scientific consensus leans toward an asteroid that exploded in the atmosphere, what's called an airburst, releasing energy equivalent to somewhere between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT. That's roughly 1,000 times the power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, all from an object that may have been no wider than 50 to 60 meters across. The entire event lasted less than a minute, and over a century later, we're still filling in gaps. That might already seem like enough mystery for one video. It is not. On the other side of the planet, deep in the jungles of the Gigas Delta in southern Costa Rica, farm workers in the 1930s were clearing land for a United Fruit Company banana plantation when their machetes started hitting something hard. Round. Perfectly round. They had found the first of what would eventually be cataloged as hundreds of stone spheres scattered across the Costa Rican landscape. The largest ones measure over 2 meters in diameter. The heaviest weigh 16 tons, and they are almost geometrically perfect. Not within a few centimeters of perfect, genuinely close to spherical, though measurements on surviving specimens show some variation of several centimeters, partly due to centuries of erosion. Here's the thing. The people who made these spheres, a pre-Columbian civilization we know remarkably little about, had no metal tools. They had no wheels. They had no written language that has survived. And they were somehow shaping gabbro boulders, a dense volcanic rock, into near-perfect spheres, likely by a combination of controlled fracturing, abrasion, and grinding, with a precision that would impress a modern stonecutter. The real mystery isn't the craftsmanship, it's the purpose. We have no idea what these spheres were for. Some were found in alignment, some were arranged in geometric patterns, some appear to have been placed deliberately in relation to the cardinal directions, but the civilization that made them left no explanation. They were largely gone before European contact, possibly due to disease or conflict, and the knowledge of what these spheres meant went with them. There are theories, astronomical markers, status symbols for chiefs, boundary markers between territories, spiritual objects, but every theory remains exactly that, a theory. These spheres are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. and they are, at their core, a beautiful message written in stone by people we'll never fully know. From the tangible to the textual. In a monastery in Bohemia, now the Czech Republic, sometime around the year 1230, a scribe began work on what would become the largest surviving medieval manuscript in the world, the Codex Gigas. In Latin, that means giant book. It is by any measure enormous, 90 centimeters tall, 50 centimeters wide, nearly 75 kilograms. Its 310 pages were made from the treated skin of around 160 donkeys. But here's something most people don't realize. The most striking thing about the Codex Gigas is not its size, it's the consistency. The entire manuscript, which includes a complete Latin Bible, medical texts, a history of Bohemia, various legal texts, and a calendar, appears to have been written by a single person, in a single, remarkably uniform script. Experts have estimated that producing this manuscript would have taken one scribe working full-time for 20 to 30 years, without a single significant change in handwriting, without visible deterioration in the penmanship. Medieval legend claimed it was written in a single night by a monk who had sold his soul to the devil, hence its other name, the Devil's Bible. The monk, the story goes, had been condemned to be walled up alive for breaking his monastic vows, and in desperation made a pact with Lucifer to complete the book before dawn in exchange for his freedom. We can dismiss the legend. What we cannot dismiss is the physical reality of the manuscript, and the fact that despite extensive analysis, no one has produced a fully satisfying explanation for how one person could have worked with such absolute consistency over such an extended period. It sits today in the National Library of Sweden in Stockholm, and it is, whatever else it may be, one of the most astonishing objects ever produced by human hands. Now let's go to the English countryside, or anywhere in England, really, since the summer of any given year. Crop circles, you've heard of them. You probably have an opinion about them already. And your opinion is probably correct. Most of them, the vast majority, are made by humans with planks, ropes, and a decent sense of geometry. That is not in serious scientific dispute. But here's what actually is in dispute, and what tends to get buried under the noise of the alien conversation. A small but persistent subset of crop circle cases have features that researchers in materials science and plant biology have found genuinely difficult to explain through conventional hoaxing. These include plant stems that are bent at the nodes rather than broken, suggesting they were exposed to a sudden burst of heat rather than mechanically flattened. Soil samples from inside certain formations showing changes in crystalline structure consistent with microwave heating. And in a handful of documented cases, eyewitness accounts of formation events involving luminous phenomena, balls of light that appeared to move with purpose above fields just before a circle was discovered. Scientists who study these anomalous cases, and this is a small but credentialed group, are not claiming alien spacecraft. They're asking a narrower question. Is there an as-yet unidentified natural atmospheric or electromagnetic phenomenon that can, under certain conditions, flatten vegetation in precise geometric patterns? That question has not been answered. It remains technically open. The broader mystery of crop circles isn't really about aliens. It's about the fact that we've been so eager to debunk the silly version of the story that we may have walked past a genuinely strange natural puzzle. In 1947, an American pilot named James Gaussman was flying a mission over China near the end of the Second World War when he spotted something extraordinary from the air. A vast, white, pyramidal structure rising from the flatlands of Shanxi province. He estimated it was twice the size of any pyramid in Egypt. He reported it. A photograph was taken, and then the whole thing essentially disappeared into the fog of post-war bureaucracy and Cold War politics. The White Pyramid of China, if it exists in the form described, would be among the largest man-made structures ever built. Chinese authorities have historically been reluctant to grant foreign researchers access to the Shanxi region, which is known to contain the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, along with tens of thousands of terracotta warriors, and, almost certainly, many more burial structures yet to be excavated. Satellite imagery has revealed dozens of pyramid-shaped mounds across the region. Most are believed to be burial mounds of the Han Dynasty emperors, but the sheer number of them, and the restrictions on access, have kept the specific structure Gaussman described tantalizingly unverified. Some researchers believe the White Pyramid may simply be a large burial mound with a pale clay crust. Others believe satellite resolution hasn't been sufficient to fully assess the site. What we do know is this. The Chinese landscape contains monumental structures that the outside world has barely studied, and the official position of the Chinese government has been consistently that these sites are not open for investigation. That silence, more than anything, is what keeps this mystery alive. Not all mysteries are man-made. In 1938, a South African museum curator named Marjorie Courtenay Latimer noticed something unusual among a batch of fish that a local trawler had brought into port near the Chalumna River. One of them was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was large, about 1.5 meters long. It had thick, fleshy, lobe-like fins that looked almost like limbs. Its scales were a pale bluish purple, with an iridescent silver blue-green sheen. She preserved it, wrote to a friend who was a fish expert, and together they identified it as a Coelacanth, a species that the fossil record said had gone extinct approximately 65 million years ago, at the same time as the dinosaurs. Let that sit for a moment. A fish, alive, that the entire scientific community had assumed was long dead. The coelacanth is what biologists call a Lazarus taxon, a species that disappears from the fossil record and then impossibly reappears in the living world. But here's what I find even more fascinating than its survival. The coelacanth is not a primitive animal. It has changed remarkably little in the hundreds of millions of years since its earliest ancestors. In a world where evolution drives constant change, the coelacanth found a formula and kept it. Deep ocean, slow metabolism, hunting nocturnally in underwater caves. Recent research suggests they may live up to 100 years and don't reach sexual maturity until around 50. It is, in the most literal sense, a living fossil, a creature that watched the dinosaurs rise and fall and simply kept swimming. We now know of 2 living species, one in the Indian Ocean, one near Indonesia, first spotted in 1997 and formally described as a new species in 1999. Their populations are small, fragile, and threatened by bycatch, but they are here. They are alive. And every time a coelacanth surfaces in a net or a camera frame, it is a reminder that the Earth's inventory of life is never truly closed. And then there is the Voynich Manuscript. Found in 1912 by a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich in a chest of old books at an Italian Jesuit college, this document is, depending on your level of patience for mystery, either the most fascinating object in the history of linguistics or the most infuriating. It is a handwritten, illustrated codex, carbon dated to the early 15th century. It is written entirely in an unknown script. Every page is covered in flowing, confident text that appears to have internal linguistic structure, repeated patterns, consistent word lengths, the statistical fingerprints of a real language. It is illustrated with drawings of plants that don't quite match any known species, anatomical diagrams that don't quite match any known human anatomy, and astronomical charts that don't quite match any known star map. Over a century of analysis, including by professional cryptographers, NSA codebreakers, and linguists from across the world, has not produced a single word of confirmed translation. Not one. There are 3 broad theories. The first, it's a genuine lost language or cipher that we simply haven't cracked yet. The second, it's an elaborate medieval hoax, designed to look like an arcane text and sell to a wealthy buyer. The third, proposed in some computational linguistics research, it may be a constructed language, possibly created by someone with a specific philosophical or spiritual system in mind. The problem is that none of these theories has produced a breakthrough. Every apparent decode has eventually collapsed under scrutiny. The manuscript sits in the Bineca Rare Book Library at Yale University, fully digitized and available to the public, and it remains, after 110 years of sustained human attention, completely illegible. 7 mysteries. Across 6 continents, spanning 15 centuries, touching physics and biology and archaeology and linguistics, and the ancient geometry of lost civilizations. What do they share? Not aliens, not the supernatural. What they share is something simpler and more profound. They are the places where human knowledge runs up against its own edges, where the evidence is real, but the explanation hasn't arrived yet, or where the explanation existed once, in the mind of someone who is now gone and was never written down. Here's something that should make us think. The coelacanth existed for 65 million years before we knew it was still alive. The pyramids of Shanxi have sat in the Chinese earth for 2,000 years, while the world looked the other way. The spheres of Costa Rica lay in the jungle for centuries before a banana company's machete struck the first one. The planet does not announce itself. It waits. And the mysteries that remain unsolved are not failures of science, they are invitations. They are the universe's way of reminding us that curiosity is not a problem to be solved, but a posture to be maintained. We don't know everything. We never will. And somehow that is the best news there is.